Welcome. My name is Enrique Desmond Arias. I am the director of the Bildner Center for Western Hemisphere Studies and a professor in political science here at the Graduate Center. Today we are pleased to be welcoming Claudia López, the former mayor of Bogotá, to our campus. Before introducing Dr. López, I wanted to thank Dr. John Mollenkoff, the director of the Center for Urban Research here, who graciously co-sponsored the events with us, and we are very happy to be able to co-sponsor an event on urbanism in Latin America with our Urban Studies Center here. So thank you, John. Claudia López served as mayor of Bogotá, Colombia, from January 20th until December 2023. As Bogotá's first female mayor and openly LGBTQ plus mayor, she had an emphatic focus on environmental, social, and anti-corruption issues. López additionally served as senator for the Republic of Colombia, between 2014 and 2018, and ran as a vice presidential candidate in 2018. As a senator, she set an example in the fight against corruption with results never seen before, and became a prominent figure in the political arena. I would add that Claudia came to my attention long before this, when she was a journalist and a scholar working on paramilitarism, crime, and violence in Colombia, where she published a series of seminal books and journalistic publications on violence in the region, which has been hugely influential of scholars, including my own work. And so I am greatly appreciative of that work. Even though we are talking about your work as mayor of Bogotá. Dr. López did her undergraduate work at the Universidad Externado in Colombia. She holds a master's degree in public administration and urban policy from Columbia University, and she earned her PhD in political science from Northwestern University. Currently, she is an ALI fellow at Harvard University. The title of her talk, which builds on her work as mayor of Bogotá, is Urban Governance for Sustainable Development, Lessons from Bogotá. Thank you very much, Dr. López.
Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much, Desmond and Professor John, for your kind invitation. It's really an honor to share some ideas and experiences of a topic that I think is crucially important for this century. 2.5 billion people will be moving into cities and settling into urban environments in the next 50 years. It means that the urbanization that we saw in the last 120 years will have half of that urbanization will happen again in the next 40. So a very rapid way. And it will have hopefully positive consequences, but how it is done is partially something that we can craft much better now that we have 120 years of experiences of this on building cities around the world, particularly in the developing world, which is the region, the countries in which this urbanization is going to happen. So I just want to share some ideas to think about, really, and to reflect with you about this. So this is sort of the trend that I was mentioning on different levels of development of countries, different income levels. We have different levels of urbanization. Africa, Asia will be the regions in which the rapid urbanization will occur. Latin America is already the developing region, more urbanized. On average, 70–80% of the population of Latin America is already urbanized. So, but urbanization, of course, is agglomeration. It's the fact that people come and agglomerate themselves basically for economic opportunities, looking for either generation of economic opportunities, diversification, or income generation opportunities. That's the main driver of urbanization. And agglomeration means that we don't use land homogeneously, but we tend to go to places in which economic advantages and economic opportunities are located. So that's how actually urbanization looks like at night, concentration and agglomeration of places. I will say that probably, and this is my sort of first message, these mega cities, cities larger than 10 million people, I would say is a byproduct of a not well done urbanization in the 20th century. Such large agglomerations tend to overcome the benefits of economics of scale and also to create problems and unsustainability of scale too. Probably one of the things that we could hopefully manage to do in the 21st century is to have a more, I will say, affordable, sustainable, inclusive size of a city, large enough to have the economics of scale opportunities, but not too large to have these sort of mega cities in the world. And if you look at urbanization, there are two phenomena that happen hand in hand. The industrialization, the manufacturing industrialization of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century went hand in hand with the urbanization that we live up to today. So that's why the economic activity and the income generated by that economic activity is highly correlated with the same urban agglomeration that we saw before. So you see how economics looks like in the United States. That's how actually the population and the economic engines and generation of growth and income looks like in a country such as the United States. So for those of you who are interested in urban planning and urban development, or from any science or field that you're interested in, urban development is by definition an interdisciplinary field of study. That's part of the beauty of it. And I will say that there are 5 factors. When you do urban planning, you're trying to accommodate 5 main issues, I will say. 4 of them, I will say, are pretty obvious and have been taught in universities throughout the century. As I said before, the first thing that people come to look for in cities are economic opportunities, jobs, income generation. That's the main driver of urban agglomeration. But I will say that precisely because we live in an era of climate change consequences, we need to understand that urban planning should start, and that's sort of my second message, by nature. Nature is what is there before we are agglomerated, what will be there after we agglomerate. And if the best urban planner in any city is water. If we understand the hydrological cycles of our environments and nature around, that's the best urban planner ever. And the most we try to resist or try to, not to pay attention seriously to how the cycle of water is organized in nature, the most trouble we're going to have both in urban and rural areas. So for those of you who study urban planning, the first top highest urban planner ever is water. And water surrounding nature should be the first issue we should take into account. Then, if you agglomerate, you need to provide, that was probably one of the best histories of urbanization throughout the 20th century, is how urbanization drive a lot of innovations. I mean, we have the Metro of New York, and New York is what it is because it was the first city who has a metro, which has a metro. And a lot of innovations, the metro, the sewage, the aqueduct, then later on energy at a massive, large scale. So public utilities and public provision of utilities, particularly clean water and sewage, is other part of traditionally of planning. And of course, people not only come to work, they need to live somewhere. They need to rest and have a family and house a family. So housing provision is also a crucial topic in urban planning. Combining nature, public goods provision, housing and utilities is sort of the traditional thing, along with transportation. I will say that more recently, and precisely because urbanization is happening at a large scale in developing countries, not in large scale industrial manufactured places, but in very informal economies, in places in which, for example, in Colombia, 52% of the population works in informal jobs, in informal economy. There are many cities or places still in Colombia or in Asia or in Africa, in which 80, 90% of the population works in informal jobs. So if you don't have, we are a creature, we humans, we are creatures who need care at very different stages in our life. Different from other creatures in nature, we are not able to take care of ourselves when we are born. You know, other creatures, they are born and they start running, right? We cannot. So we need care by definition. That's something essential for human beings, care provision. We need care when we are a child, at least. We're children. When we are going to be elders, we're going to need a special care. If we get to have some disability, we're going to need a special care. If you have a formal economy, you probably have a social security system who's able or organized and institutionalized to provide that care. Child care, you may have some sort of health provision, pension provision. But if you don't have a formal economy able to fund and support an institutionalized system of care or social security, who provides that care? Because we need it. Somebody's provided it. The answer is women. Women provide that care. Women at the expense of her own opportunities, of her own time, of her own health, of her education, of their inclusion in the labor market. So this issue of the care economy, of the care services, amazingly, has not been centered in urban planning. And I said amazingly because it has been there forever, but we took it for granted, or because of cultural norms and cultural reasons, many societies think that the fact that women sacrifice their health, education, income, labor, development in order to take care for free of others, working on average 7 more hours per day with no payment at all to take care of others, that's sort of normal. That's the way it should be. So my third message is, well, it doesn't have to be that way. It's not normal that you sacrifice the development, the potential of half of your population on average, which are women, in order to provide a service that should be provided as any other services, water or energy or education or health or any other service should be provided, either public, either private, or in a mixed fashion, but should be institutionally provided and not taken for granted that way. So combining these 5 elements is the magic of doing urban planning. Of course, along with them comes many other factors, but I will see the newcomer into this sort of palette to use different tools and instruments for urban planning is care nowadays. And you can combine those elements in many different ways across territory. But I will say that, and that's my 4th message, and this image is just to evoke this debate. It's not only combining those 5 elements, but if you combine them in a mixed, dense land use planning form, it's much more inclusive, it's much more affordable, it's much more feasible from the financial point of view. It's better to aggregate demands, to take advantage of economies of scale, and to provide different elements in a more balanced way. You have, let me put it an example of this country. The United States has only 350 million people, almost in a planet that is almost of 6 billion people, right? But the way the United States industrialized and urbanized consume 25% of the planet. India has 1.4 billion people. Half of its urbanization is still to happen. If India follows the path of the United States industrialization and urbanization, there is no planet B. We will be gone. Because then India will need roughly two more planets, according to the United States standards. So this low density, not mixed, transportation based in individual cars, fossil fuel based mobilization is simply unsustainable. It's simply unsustainable for any country, for the planet. There is simply no planet enough, no resources, no natural resources enough to carry out us in that way. So we really need to change, and probably both for economic inclusivity, for social inclusivity, but also for environmental sustainability and feasibility, we really need to change the way we can plan cities for those 2.5 billion people who's coming to cities. And we can do it. We now have the experiences, the knowledge, the advantage to take into account this kind of thing. So this is another way to evoke this debate. This is a graph about how walkable cities are. How close, how long it takes for a citizen in a city to get off their home and get to the public or private service, either public transportation or job or education. How long does it take? By walking. This is how walkable, how long will it take? So the argument here is a measure that tries to capture this mixed, dense use planning. The shorter it is, we assume the closer it is to get to different private and public goods and services. Yet, when I saw this graph and I saw Bogotá, right? I know you look at them and Bogotá in the map, it's sort of relatively blue, relatively walkable, right? But if you see, it's sort of along with, Vienna and Madrid. And as much as I love Bogotá, I know for sure that Bogotá is not like Vienna or Madrid. Vienna or Madrid has at least 12 metro lines, much more green space. Right? So why are we in the walkable index relatively close? And that's something that measure is capturing an effect that, yes, reflects density, but not necessarily inclusivity. So the way we have this similar 15-minute walkable index to these cities is because people in informal settlements, or even formal, but very popular settlements in Bogotá, working on informal economy, they walk around their neighborhood to work because they can't afford to pay public transportation to reach the areas of the city that are much better provided with infrastructure and services and jobs. So it's not that they don't want to. They want these kind of jobs. They need these kind of jobs. These kind of jobs are both formal and informal jobs in the center of the city, and the most well-served part of the cities are much better, are better paid. But because of economic exclusion, they cannot reach that. So yes, they work a lot, but this is working because of exclusion of the labor market. This is working because of poverty. This is working because of informality. So it's not that we're walking shorter distances, such as in Vienna or in Madrid, because you have a metro or a bus station nearby, very close, 5 minutes from your home, because there is a huge network that is able to connect you easily and affordable to different places and to different opportunities in the city. That's not the case. It's because there is no such a provision, and so people need to rely on informal jobs that they reach by walking. So I just want to say that, when I'm talking about density has different perspectives and different meanings. You may have mixed, dense land use planning. Bogotá has it for sure. It's one of the most denser places in the city, in the world, and that's one of the advantages of Bogotá. But it can capture inequalities in the city which are not desirable. So this is something you need to unpack when you see these kind of indexes. And this, I will say, is the easiest and probably the hardest change to make in a city. And probably the United States is one of the countries and cities in which this can be more explicit. So here is what, if you think in the case of Bogotá, let me give you this figure and why this is important. This is just a figure that is arguing in favor of redistributing public space for mobility purposes, according to the users, according to the inclusivity and the sustainability from the environmental point of view of uses. So we all humans, we are all by definition pedestrians. We all can walk. That's our own mode of transportation. Absolutely clean, zero emissions by walking. In a city such as Bogotá, 24% of the daily trips are done by walking. 24, 1 out of 4. Only 20% of Bogotanos own a private car. Only 17% of the daily trips in the city are done by a private car. Yet private cars occupy or takes 70% of the public space for mobility. If somebody from Mars look at us from outside, probably they will figure it out that the inhabitants of this planet are cars. That's probably what they will see more, spread around the world and around the places. So this is, again, as I mentioned before, is simply unfeasible. Economically, it's unfeasible. And if you think that we can get rid of all the gas and oil engine cars and replace them by electric cars, then maybe we won't have pollution, for sure. But we anyway will have a lot of congestion. Congestion will be exactly the same if by a magic, course, in a minute, you can transform all the cars in the United States into electrics. Congestion will be exactly the same. And productivity, because time lost in congestion, will be exactly the same. Exactly the same. So it's not the most efficient way to use space. Of course, then public transportation is by far much more efficient to do that, and that's one of the advantages of New York, as I mentioned before. But doing this transformation, redistributing space according to the use, giving more space to the pedestrian, walkable, those trips that cause no pollution at all, cyclists and other alternative modes of transportation, or clean public transportation. We're not doing this, not because we're still, hoping to have a new technological invention that allowed us to do that. It's really a political decision. Who gets the space and for what? And how the space is used. And I will say, and that's my fifth message, I will say this: organizing and distributing public space for mobility according to the use, to inclusion. Let me give you this number, and this is you can measure this in cities as is not particular from Bogotá. 75% of the users of public transportation in Bogotá, it also happens in India, we have very different cultures, are done by women. A woman use more public transportation because women do more trips on average than men. Men tend to do more linear trips from home to job, from job to home. Care trips, women would do on average 3 times more trips per day because they go to the school, they go to the grocery, they may go to a city doctor to take their own mother or father to take to the doctor appointment. Those caring trips are shorter and are more linear and are more frequent for women. So a woman moves 3 times more in shorter trips that are non-linear, but cost them triple, because you have to pay 3 different times at least the trip. So making public transportation inclusive is taking into account all these different motifs and modes and types of trips and of transportation. So multimodality, different types of public transportation, different types. Probably we may have, and probably soon will have, smaller, not these big buses as the one we have in Transmilenio in Bogotá, or as the ones we have here in MTA. Probably because of technological evolution, we may have shorter buses, buses that are not for 80 people, buses that are probably for 20 people, which will have probably no driver and can do shorter, more flexible trips around the city. That's something that probably technology will allow us to do soon. But anyway, combining decarbonize multimodal modes of transportation. In the case of Bogotá, we're just building the first metro line, but we have cable cars, we have cycloways, 500 kilometers of cycloways. When I came to study to Columbia 24 years ago, I joined those cyclists that were pushing for cycloways in the New York City. There was no 1 kilometer of cycloway 25 years ago in New York. It took a huge fight to get those cycloways dedicated, organized, segregated, because simply they are safer. The same way that cars have segregated space for mobility to make their trip efficient, why not for pedestrians? That's the reason we have sidewalks. And why not segregated cycloways? That's the reason. So this is important. This is the fifth factor that I wanna mention. And now, because there is no, there are exceptions, of course, but on average, we will have to do urban renewal, which is a word that, has a huge charge of history, a legacy. But we will have to improve, let's say, the city that we already have to bring it to the nature standards, to the public space and green space and care services and multimodal transportation. I mean, we need to rebuild our cities to provide this kind of urban planning. And at the same time, we need also to develop new land combining these 5 factors, right? So in the case of Bogotá, which is a city that basically already occupied the land that it has allowed for the city to occupy. There are not that much land for new developments, and we have clear boundaries. Up in the mountains, we have this. How many of you have been in Bogotá before? Wow, many of you. So as you know, we are surrounded by these beautiful mountains in the east, right? And we have our large Bogotá River on the west. So those are very clear natural boundaries. You cannot go beyond them, basically. And we are located 2,600 meters above the level of the sea. It's a beautiful cordillera in the Andes. But when you come to Bogotá, you may ask yourself, wait, what's the reason that these crazy people decided to build the capital of Colombia 500 kilometers away from the nearest port, right? 2,600 meters above the level of the sea, in the middle of 3 mountains, yeah? What's the reason? Well, it's partially because 500 years ago, that the higher you were, the less tropical the weather was. And at that time, welcome to the tropic today is still a challenge. 500 years ago, for health development was even worse. So one reason was health purposes. Second reason, water. Even though we are at such a high level, we have the Paramount, the waterlands of the Sumapaz, Chingasa. Half of the Paramounts and waterlands in the planet are located in Colombia, half of them. So we have water dripping, clean, 4,500 meters above us. The day in which we have to bump up water 2,600 meters above the level of the sea, Bogotá will be unfeasible. So we have to take seriously the challenge of protecting these waterlands and paramount lands. But when we rebuild the city, for example, we are now, all these lines are different modes of transportation, either new BRT lines or new metro lines or new cable cars providing this system. Closer to this public transportation system, we're building the care blocks, for example, to provide services for caregivers and for care receivers. We combine these multimodal modes of transportation precisely to take care of, caregiver trips or job trips, which are different. But when we invest all that money rebuilding the city, remaking it the city, taking advantage of the combination that we need to do, we need to then bring closer to the new public transportation that we are doing, housing, unemployment, and social services and care services. Because there is no reason, it doesn't make sense for any city to build a new metro line, let's say, which aggregates people and aggregates demand. That's exactly what a metro line will do, or what a BRT will do. The higher the frequency, the higher the demand you aggregate. If you're going to aggregate that, it's much better for the city to have closer to those stations both housing and jobs opportunities. And if you're going to have people with housing and with jobs, that's exactly the place in which you need to have care services, for example. So these yellow areas are areas according to the POT of Bogotá, Plan de Ordenamiento Territorial, or Master Urban Development Plan of the city, in which precisely because we are aggregated demand for new lines or metro lines of public transportation, those are the areas that we're going to redevelop in higher density, combining both housing, jobs, and care blocks. So that's part of rebuilding the city you already have, but that's something that also can be done in cities that are just developing right now. Now, in the last decades, there is now this, outrage against globalization, and people tend to think, if you ask them, well, has poverty or inequality increased in the world in the last 20 or 30 years? You make this question to any audience, this audience or whoever, and roughly more than half, 60, 70% people will say inequality has increased. And that's true for the United States, but that's not true for the world at large. Both poverty and inequality has decreased largely in the last 30 years. And if some countries such as the United States were the other way around, where inequality increasing, then which places were the ones decreasing poverty and decreasing inequality? China, for example, is decreasing poverty and decreasing inequality. India, in some parts of India, is decreasing, let's say Karnataka is decreasing poverty and inequality. There are other places in India which are not, but this is the global trend. This is the global trend. Extreme poverty, it's the same thing. The reduction has been, of course, because of the pandemic. Unfortunately, many of these trends were reversed, and that's part of what is causing all the political backlash that we are looking now. But precisely because there is the trend, the trend is fantastic, but when you are one person in that, little space in which 1 billion people is still under poverty, 1 billion people is a huge amount of people. So you don't want to be there. And that's why doing social policy and economic policy is important. And this is the sixth thing that I want to call your attention, because different from the 20th century urbanization that was hand in hand with manufacturing industrialization, what is happening in this century, in Africa particularly, is that urbanization is happening, but without manufacturing industrialization. Such correlation that existed throughout the 20th century no longer holds, at least in the case of Africa. And that's a huge challenge. That's a huge challenge, because it means that African cities are going to have anyway the people agglomeration, but are not having the jobs agglomeration needed for the people. So either there will be, if you ask Danny Roderick, for example, and this is a discussion of in the economic field, it seems that after globalization, the global economy in general, one country is more than others, but the global economy in general is much more towards services than towards manufacturing. So probably one of the things that we need to think through from all fields of knowledge is how to generate labor-absorbing services. Because anyway, people will come and agglomerate looking for jobs and opportunities. If it is not the typical manufacturer-based industrialization, then what will be? And that's a huge challenge that we have. Because this is relatively new, this trend. It didn't happen in the 20th century, but it's happening now. and particularly in Africa. So I want to come back to this care economy, because that's one of the consequences of not having this match between manufacture-based industrialization and urbanization, is that you're going to have a lot of people, particularly youth and women, in a non-diversified, non-job generation economy. Meaning they are in this informal economy, which maybe they can multi-purpose use their homes to do some small business, to get some money, maybe to sell some stuff around the neighborhood, to make a living. But then this typical woman, this is two women in Bogotá, but this picture could be in India, or could be in Nigeria, or could be in many other places in Southeast, in Asia too. These are women then that has to generate income from home, work 7 more hours a day, also in caring services. So informal work, larger hours, low productivity, lower paid. And on top of that, care works, 7 hours on average more of work with no pay at all. So the trap of poverty, particularly for women, is enormous. It's enormous, a huge challenge in the urbanization that we received from the 20th century, and it will be even worse probably in the urbanization of the 21st century. The women that were elected to Colombian Congress in 2010 from different parties approved a law ordering the Colombian state to measure the care economy in the national macroeconomic accounts. The argument, which was rightly so, was if that work would have been paid and marketized, how much income they will generate, how much growth they will generate, how much they contribute anyway to the gross national product of Colombia. So the Colombian state has been measuring the care economy, at least in the last decade. And because of that, we know that the care services, mainly provided by unpaid care women, is the largest industrial service in Colombia. It's the largest service in Colombia. It's sort of the service industry of the 21st century without no other industry could work. And it accounts for 13% of Bogotá's GDP. It accounts for 20% of Colombia's GDP. It contributes more than the coffee economy. It contributes more than the oil and gas economy. But it is done in this unpaid care mode. So one of the things that we try to do, and this is sort of the broad picture of how a woman, a caregiver, 90% of them are women, 10% of them are men, are going to look like in Bogotá. There's at least 1.2 million people. And what I decided, you can imagine I'm the first woman ever to be elected mayor of Bogotá, so I have to do something really meaningful for the women in Bogotá. And we decided to work. I said, with the social movement of women in Bogotá, with the feminist movement. There is a women's city council elected by the social movement, and it is in charge of participating and suggesting and holding accountable the government. So we decided to focus and to think about in this care economy and how can we help as a city government. I'm not a national government, so I cannot set up a social security system. It's not under my possibilities as mayor or of any mayor. But because of decentralization in Colombia, local governments in Colombia are in charge of social services, education services, health services, infrastructure for mobility. So what we decided to do with the care blocks is to use the social infrastructure that we already have in place and adapt the infrastructure and add tailor-made services, which has 3 purposes: to recognize, to reduce, and to redistribute unpaid care work from the shoulders of women over the shoulders of either other members of the family or members of the mayor's office, public servants in the mayor's office. So we organize these care blocks. We provide services for the caregivers. We reduce the poverty of time that they are facing. We're able to reduce between 6 to 8 hours per week of unpaid care work to these women. In those 6 to 8 hours of week, then now this woman can rest, can finish school, can do post-secondary education, can get a job, can organize themselves to participate in social politics or in politics. I mean, a huge amount of opportunities for them. And at the same time, in the same infrastructure, we provide the services for the care receivers, who are mainly children, people with disabilities, or elders. And we also do cultural transformation, because at least in Latin America and many places also, this overburden of unpaid care work over the shoulders of women are a cultural norm. It's because of patriarchalism and machism that society has this idea that we women have to do this on our own. So we created the School for Men to learn to work, to learn to care. And as I said, always, men of this world, you're welcome to learn to care. You don't know how to cook, we can teach you. You don't know how to do chores at home, we can teach you. You don't know how to read with your kids and bring them to the school, we can teach you. You don't know how to, bring your own grandfather or grandma to the doctor and take care of their health, we can teach you. Those are the type of care activities and care activities that the women do. So those are the three types of services. Services for transformation mainly for men, services for care receivers, services for caregivers. This is how sort of an ideal care block looks like. It combines different types of infrastructures and services nearby, less than 15 minutes by walking, so that is reachable by the woman and the members of their families without being excluded by, the necessity to pay public transportation or transportation at all. And this is how the services looks like in a care block. There were no care blocks in 2020 when I became mayor of Bogotá. And this problem became worse because of the pandemic. 600,000 women who already left unpaid care work and were into the labor market returned to the unpaid care work because of the pandemic. They lost their jobs and become to the unpaid care work. So the problem not only was huge, but worse because of the pandemic. We created in total in 3 years, 24 care blocks. We have four types, different type of services of provision. Care blocks is the one we provide in our own social infrastructure of the city. In very rural, dispersed places in which we don't have enough or close enough infrastructure, we use these mobility services. We call it the care buses. And there are people who have such severe disabilities, they literally cannot move out of home. So what we do is to go to their homes of the caregivers and provide assistance in the care home assistant way. This is how one of the care blocks of Bogotá looks like in a very popular neighborhood in the south of the city, in Ciudad Bolívar, nearby a cable car station. And what we are doing is just combining different infrastructures. I don't know if I can, but there is the car cable station there, and next to the cable car, this was actually an administrative kind of service and center that we have down there. And we adapted internally to be able to provide services, 2-3 hours of childcare service, for example, for kids, or 2-3 hours for elders. Nearby there is a school, nearby there is a health center. So we use different infrastructure to provide services, but the key is that this infrastructure has to be nearby, less than 15 minutes, so the users can handle it easily and with no other expenses. This in rural areas is the type of provision of care buses. That's something, by the way, that we did thanks to the generosity of the Bloomberg Philanthropy Initiative. Probably one of the best things that happened to mayors throughout the world is that Michael Bloomberg was mayor, and he realized mayors are martyrs and has been incredibly generous with mayors throughout the world. The Global Mayors Challenge, for example, is one of the best well-known challenges that we mayors can apply with initiatives and receive support from the Bloomberg Philanthropies. This idea of the care buses came out of a support of a project by the Bloomberg Philanthropies. This is the care home assistance for people who have persons with severe disabilities and not easy for them to move out of home. And we were lucky enough that during our term, we need to do, but this is where we were really lucky as an administration, because during our term, the city has to enact the first climate emergency plan, because Colombia agreed to the Paris Agreement and they have to set up national goals, and they did it. So after that, to Colombia to comply with all those goals of climate change and reduction of green emission of CO2 emissions, the cities had to enact a local plan according to the national plan to fulfill the national goals. So we were able to enact in our period the climate action plan, the regional mobility plan, and the new revision or upgrade of the master urban plan, the Plan de Ordenamiento Territorial, which we're very lucky because we managed to make them coherent and consistent. And for example, the urban plan of Bogotá is the first urban plan in Latin America that includes care as a fundamental criteria of urban planning. In the same way that we plan water provision or transportation provision, we set up a rule of care provision. So we created 24 care blocks, but in order for any woman of Bogotá to have less than 30 minutes from their home a care block, the city has to build in total 45 care blocks in the next 15 years. And that's now a law in the city. Yesterday, for example, I left office in January, but yesterday, for example, the 25th Manzana del Cuidado was inaugurated in Bogotá because this is now a mandate by law in the city. This is some of the achievements and the people who were able to serve the 24 care blocks. And all this combination, I will say that this is a good economic policy, this is good urban policy, but this is also good economic policy, this combination of the factors that I've been mentioning. Of course, the pandemic hit us enormously in the year 2020. That's exactly what you don't want to happen to you when you're mayor, right? I mean, after a year, my friends called me and asked me, well, Claudia, how well is doing the city? How well are you doing in the mayor's office? And I said, well, you know what? Everything that I came to improve has worsened, everything. Because I started in January, and in March, the whole pandemic started. Unemployment triples, poverty triples, insecurity rises. I mean, social unrest, we have paro nacional. I mean, it was tough. But agreeing and investing in this massive public transportation, 70 schools, 24 care blocks, 8 new health centers. We tripled the intensive care units of the city, for example, because of the pandemic. We have to move rapidly in that direction. Because of the investment also in the urban renewal plan of the city, all that combined, ultimately in 3 years, we're able to recover more jobs than we lost it. Now, we lost 1.1 million jobs, and we recovered 1.4. Poverty declined enormously. Even we're still missing just 1 point of extreme poverty to be under lower level than in 2019. So this can have effects pretty rapidly, and of course long-term effects even more. But it's, I have to say honestly that probably during normal times, the pandemic was awful in many senses, but it also provided us with room to maneuver, to innovate, and to do such large investment. And this is another thing that I'm very proud of, because as I said, and this happens, everywhere, unfortunately, youth and women are those more badly hidden in any economic crisis. They are the first one to lose their jobs and the last one to recover it. So Another thing that we were able to do was supporting business according to retention or creation of new jobs. We expend subsidies to support the business community of our city, particularly small and medium businesses. But we did it in such a way that, on average, if they keep or create a new job, we will support them roughly 0.5% of the minimum salary monthly for a year for that worker, to help out the business and to help out the person, the worker. But if it was a woman, then we support not 50, but 70, right? If it is an ethnic-based woman, either Afro or indigenous, which are more heavily excluded on the market, then it's not 80, but 90, right? So it is progressive in the sense that the larger the factors of exclusion of people, the larger the economic incentive to include the more excludable. And I'm very proud that the gap, there is always the unemployment rate of women is larger than the unemployment rate of men. So these policies not only recover employment, both for men and women, but we're able to help reduce the gap. And the tendency is still in 24. So when you work with the business sector in such a way, it has this kind of effects. The care blocks are now spread out to other cities. We are learning. For example, now in Iztapalapa city, Clara Brugada was the mayor of Iztapalapa, is now the new mayor of Mexico City. She did care blocks. She named them utopias in Iztapalapa. But it's the same concept, and we learn together. They started being recreation, sport, and cultural centers, but now we learn together, and they include also care services such as in Bogotá. And the other way around in Bogotá, which we started with these care services, now we are able to include more cultural and sport and recreation services. I'm glad to say that Clara is going to do 100 utopias in the next 6 years in Ciudad de Mexico, and that for sure will be a huge change. This is a couple of examples of utopias or care blocks in Mexico City and Iztapalapa. So just to finish, I have to say that these things happen, when people ask how this could happen. Well, it requires democracy, it requires voice, it requires participation, it requires accountability, it requires money, of course, to be able to do this. So in one word, it requires democratic governance. And one of the reasons that we were able to maneuver and to include and to innovate and to create services that were not there before, well, certainly because we needed, and there was a need and a social agreement to do that. I offered that in my platform as a candidate, and then precisely because of the pandemic, we have to do even more and more rapid these kind of initiatives. But also because of decentralization, as I mentioned before. Until 1988, mayors in Colombia were appointed by the president, were not elected by the people, for example. So it changed. With political decentralization, then fiscal decentralization improves. So Bogotá is the city that is, and Cali and Medellín and Barranquilla and Bucaramanga, and 35 cities have improved enormously in the last 35 years, along with decentralization, because they were able to improve their economic base, their tax base, to raise local taxes, to be able to provide with more autonomy, decided with their citizens rather than with the presidents or other stakeholders, what to do with that investment. And the larger, this is the comparison of how much taxes are collected at the national level, or how much transfers from the national government or subsidies from the national government you receive. The more you receive, the less autonomy you have, because of course these are directed, let's say, transfers. You receive money, but it has to go to certain rules. This is how different subnational governments use their resources, either how much they account for GDP or how much they account for total public expenditures in a country. It's another way to measure fiscal decentralization. And this is how decentralization looks like in Latin America. So as you could see, Colombia is probably the highest decentralized country in Latin America, being known a non-federal country, because Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil are federal, and of course, federal systems have much more local autonomy than presidential systems. So we are closer to a federal system, and now we are in a very interesting discussion in Colombia how to do a new wave of decentralization, and particularly of fiscal decentralization. It's a large discussion at the moment of Colombia. And as much as I love cities, and city has been the engine of one of the best creations of the last 150 years, and explain a lot of the innovation and development that we have had in the last 150 years, they are also a source of problem: pollution, congestion, exclusion, segregation. But I will say that in an era of climate change, probably the hardest issue for a mayor in the 20th century was traffic, and it's still, people get mad all the time because of traffic and congestion. So traffic and mobility are typically the issues. Probably people coordinate for public services, for housing. But I will argue that where energy, water, and food came from is probably the most important thing to organize a city nowadays. If, as it happens in Bogotá right now, because of climate change factors out of the city, is the deforestation in the Amazon, for example, which is reducing the rainy season that provides water in the Andean region in Colombia. Can the mayor control deforestation in the Amazon? No, certainly not. It's not their jurisdiction, so on and so forth. But now the current mayor of Bogotá is dealing with the fact that Bogotá has shortage of water because of that change in the climate and hydrological cycle. And probably, open the faucet and not having water could get people much more mad than being in traffic. So it's a very crucial issue. So we decided to organize the city and to go into these regional, no metropolitan areas, which, in the last 50 years, probably many municipalities or counties decided to coordinate, mainly for traffic, probably for housing or public utilities. I will argue that we need to coordinate not only for housing or for public utilities or for transportation, but for water, energy, and food provision. And it will take us into it will make us think and plan and care of a larger territory than the one we used to think. The grid will be completely different. So let me show you this. If we think about the typical commuting, footprint, which is made of housing and jobs location and transportation connection. That's the typical commuting footprint. So the yellow area is the urban area of Bogotá, and all the red dots around are the commuting areas surrounding Bogotá. Okay? So this is the typical main driver of building metropolitan areas. Let's coordinate these probably 15, 20 municipalities around Bogotá, coordinate that for infrastructure and for traffic, maybe for housing. But if we think about, so urban mobility will look like this in a metropolitan area. Who do you have to coordinate with for that? But if you think about water provision, where our water came from, where it will go to, what is the ecological structure of water provision in Bogotá, then the territorial unity will look like this. It's a very different one from the transportation mobility. This is for transportation, this is for water. And if we think, well, where our food came from, this is how it looks like. So all the municipalities in our state border in Bogotá, Cundinamarca, provide food to Bogotá. Half of the food that Bogotá has come from Cundinamarca, and the other half comes from Boyacá or Tolima, other states, which are farther away. We know that for sustainability purposes, the closest the provision is, the better. Food will be fresh and nature will consume less energy and transportation costs and logistic costs into moving into the city. But we need to, it won't happen by magic. It has to be planned and organized that way. So because of these multi-territorial dimensions of different crucial factors for urban development, we created this new sort of administrative unit of coordination called the Metropolitan Region. So metropolitan areas coordinate either counties between them or municipalities in the case of Latin America between them. The Metropolitan Region, what is adding the state, the government state, or the provincial level as we call it in Colombia. So the state governor or the provincial governor is gonna also be part of the Metropolitan Region governance structure to coordinate not only mobility and not only congestion, not only housing, but water, food, economic development, and energy, and so on and so forth. So it's a very recent creation if you think, and there are different innovations moving on in the last decade, and we will see how it goes. For example, in the case of Bogotá, the Metropolitan Region is a more technical appointee rather than an elected officer. It's not an elected officer. So we popularly elect governors, we popularly elect mayors, and the director of the Metropolitan Region is chosen by the mayors and the governor, but is not popularly elected. That's how Bogotá decided to create this new urban governance structure. But in the case of Santiago de Chile, for example, that was heavily decentralized or fragmented territorially, because Chile is a very centralized presidential country. But 52 municipalities compose what we call Santiago de Chile capital. 52 municipalities. And they didn't have a figure such as the Bogotá mayor's office, in the case that I am in charge of coordinating 20 different localities within Bogotá, and also to coordinate Bogotá with these other municipalities and the governor, right? In the case of Chile, they decided that the governor of the region of Santiago de Chile will be popularly elected. And it can re-elect for one term. Recently, maybe a week ago, were the elections, and the current governor was re-elected. So two different institutional and political designs to address the same challenge, ultimately. We'll see how it goes. Right? But there is a need, because this coordination requires administrative and political designs and institutions to take care of. Somebody has to be accountable for it, otherwise it won't happen. So we'll see how it goes. And finally, I will say that this is really, I just taught a seminar in Harvard, and I really want to encourage people in the social sciences and engineer and almost any field of knowledge to get interested and to research and to learn about urbanization in the 21st century. It's a huge challenge, but I think it's a huge opportunity. Making the world that we already built more sustainable and building a better world for 2.5 billion people is a great opportunity. And for sure, you won't have any shortage of jobs, because there is a huge demand of knowledge and technicality to be used in the world for this matter. So thank you so much for your time, for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I want to know your thoughts on one issue, because migration is right now a pressing challenge for many cities, particularly in Latin America. And it's a very special challenge because most of the key decisions are made at the national level, but our cities, the ones that have to deal with all the challenges that migration encompass. In your experience, what did you learn from your experience on dealing with migration? Because Bogotá is, in the case of Colombia, the city that is receiving the most of the migrants, and how this is challenging all of these efforts that you presented us.
Yeah, it was a huge challenge. Thank you for the question. But I will say, Desmond, and for people in the political science and other fields, I would love to see a paper comparing the migration policy of Colombia and the United States and the consequences. So Colombia perspective, Colombia's government, not only Bogotá's government, Colombia's government policy has been of solidarity, of inclusion, of rapid social and economic inclusion of migration. Colombia granted 10 years of special protective status for Venezuelans. Just to give you an idea, when Colombia was under civil war during 50 years, Venezuela received 4.5 million Colombians who were fleeing economic hardship and civil war. Now it was the other way around. It's Venezuelans who are facing dictatorship and economic hardship. And we have received 3 million people. 3 million people. You have to think that there are 8 million Venezuelans outside of Venezuela at the moment. 3 of them are in Colombia. Of course, we are the neighboring state. First step, closest connection ever. 10 years of legal status protection. And the acceleration, the deliberate effort of erasing all sort of administrative barriers that could be in place unintendedly even. For example, we were able to receive in Bogotá's public schools 60,000 kids from Venezuelan families. Was it challenging? Of course. It was going to be much more challenging not to include those kids in the school. Could you imagine all the consequences we can have? If we lost 60,000 schools without kids without school. And poverty for sure. And there are all sorts of risks. No? But for example, when in the system of the school, when you're trying with the teacher or whoever is in charge is trying to register the kid, in the system, in the software system, it appears, I don't know, the ID of Colombia or the Colombian ID number of the fathers, and it didn't show up in the system, the Venezuelan temporal ID that we created. Not because we don't want it, it's because the system was not designed to take into account this kind of ID. So these kind of administrative barriers that can, be a nightmare for people when they're going to ask for a service. Both the governments of national and local governments did a huge effort of inclusion of them. So it was tough, particularly during the pandemic, because it was economic hardship both in Venezuela and in Colombia. So you're having good times, donde comen dos, comen tres, and that's easy. But if you're having hard times, donde comen dos, comen tres, yes, but there's going to be a lot of tension. So the policy of Bogotá, and I would say in general of Colombia, has been of solidarity, of legal protection, and of accelerating the social and economic inclusion of migrants. And because of the changes in the demography of Colombia, our born rate is decreasing highly in Colombia. And in the midterm, in 10 years, even now, but it will be more obvious in 10 years, you will see a huge positive impact of the migration wave into bringing new people and new skills into the labor force, for example. So it's probably something that you could see it now, but of course at the very beginning was this huge, they were competing, particularly in informal jobs. It was tense and hard because both unskilled Venezuelans and unskilled Colombians were fighting for the same very vulnerable, informal economic opportunities. So at that level, there was a lot of tension. But facilitating social inclusion and economic inclusion and not, conceding to any xenophobic uh, uh, sort of discourse, um, at least at the public's, leaders level, has helped us accelerating the inclusion. And in the next decade, we're going to have a huge benefit, net benefit impact in Colombia, thanks to that treatment of migration. Even though it was costly, of course, it took us money from us, particularly the health, I would say the child care provision, the education provision was relatively easy for us, relatively. But the public health provision is incredibly challenging. It's more costly, and because we don't receive any national support. So the national government set up the very generous policy, but they don't fund it. So we have to do it with our own resources, and there are not enough resources, particularly for the health service. So that's a challenge there.
Thank you for your presentation. I had a question about resources, specifically in finance of the city. I was wondering, how did you finance the care program, the Manzanas? In terms of, was it only municipal revenue? Did you had funding from the state or private fundings from companies or maybe international grants? And in what extent this financing is constant and permanent in order to envision long-term continuity of the program?
Yeah. So it is funded through local taxes, 99% of the funds. I mean, we have received some international funds, as I mentioned, the Bloomberg Philanthropies, for example, funded the first pilot of the care buses, for example. But it is funded through the city, no national money. And private donations, for example, we decided to include free laundry services. A woman, a caregiver woman in Bogotá can spend on average 12 hours in manual laundry and ironing a week. Of course, that's something that a machine can do much better and easy. But such a service of free community or pay community services of laundry didn't exist in the popular areas of Bogotá. So we created that service. And for that service, for example, the private sector provide that service. They donated to the care blocks the gas connection, the laundry machines, and all the machines and the connections of utilities, the private sector donated, for example. But that's a minimum cost. I would say that 99% of the cost is local tax base. And because of the legitimacy of the program, the city council approved by unanimous vote the adoption of this program that I started, no longer as my program, but as a program of the city, included in the POT of the city that by law has to be developed every 4 years and continued. And I have to, of course, be grateful to the current government who decided to continue the program. And in fact, as I said yesterday, the 25th care block was open. So it's a huge effort for our taxpayers to support a new service in the city that has been very well received, I would say.
Hello, thank you so much for this thoughtful presentation. I'd like to ask another type of challenge that you didn't mention. But what role was played by criminal actors? I think that Bogotá suffered transformation for the conflict for other reasons, especially with migration too. So what sort of challenges did you face when you held office, and what sort of policies you created in order to overcome such problems, in order to not only micro trafficking, but in like more sophisticated organized criminal groups, which were joining Bogotá for the very first time after not spending time there, but being located in other areas of Colombia?
Yeah, insecurity is a challenge and it's a nightmare. Particularly is robbery and extortion. We have the lowest homicide rate in 2022, for example, but the perception of insecurity because of extortion and robbery, particularly in the public transportation, was awful. And in the public transportation, one of the measures that was very efficient to take is that think about Transmilenio in Bogotá. So Transmilenio it's like a Medellin in Bogotá. Transmilenio is used by 2.5 million people a day. It's just that it's not a fixed neighborhood, but it's a moving neighborhood, throughout all the 12 lines of the system. But it's 2.5 million people aggregated and moving around. And Transmilenio, as such, didn't have a police service properly for the system. So we created a specific security and police service for the system. It's not enough people. It's only, at the moment, it's like 600 police officers. But robbery reduced by 35%, for example, with the creation of that system, plus cameras, plus technology, plus, reaching out the users and so on and so forth. So it has been a huge challenge, but I will say that that's something that the city needs more autonomy. I really think that regardless of who's the mayor, if the city can have, for example, a local police, such as New York, I'm sure we spend a lot of tax money supporting the national police, but we provide the money, but we just ask for favors. We cannot really coordinate and have a hierarchical order on them. If we provide more money, but have more autonomy in training them and managing them, I'm sure it will be much better for the city. But it's a deeper and structural discussion in Colombia.
So 2 questions. One is a provocation of mine for you, and another is to actually follow up on a provocation you made at LASA at the panel that I was chairing. So the provocation to you is, why do you think Medellin got to a lot of these reforms much more effectively in terms of transportation about, I don't know, I'd say 5 to 10 years before Bogotá, right? It's kind of remarkable how effective some of the transportation innovation has been there. And how often when you're in Bogotá, it feels like Bogotá's lagging. All right, so just kind of stoke the rivalry a little bit between the Valle de Aburrá and Bogotá. The second question is about democracy, right? So one of the things you spoke about in your in your talk is the importance of democracy, and these dialogues in promoting some of the changes you were talking about, engagement with society. But I wanted you to explore that a little bit more. And I wanted you to explore it in part because of what you said in this panel that I was chairing in Bogotá, where we had a bunch of political scientists on the panel, and they were talking about the dangers facing democracy in the region. It was all this very kind of liberal democratic, this liberal democratic discourse, right? Of, it's about institutions, it's about maintaining institutions, it's about managing the elections and these processes, right? And it was very much about institutions and organizations. And you kind of had this intervention that was interesting, which you said, well, you political scientists, you're always talking about institutions. We need to think about democracy in terms of participation, in terms of engagement, right? And I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you, as mayor, thought about democracy and thought about popular engagement as part of democratic process.
Well, fabulous questions. So the first one is it's actually pretty simple. I mean, it's precisely because of democracy. I mean, the politicians, the Congress members, and the local and the governor of Antioquia and Medellin have been remarkably better organized in collective action for the region than Bogotanos. We have, Antioquia probably have 15 members in Congress, between senators and House of Representative members. Bogotá have more, probably 20. But each of them works on his own. So one is effective representation by coordination of the caucus in Congress. Antioquia was by far better organized than Bogotá, up to today. The second factor was a decision of the president. A president from Antioquia, not from Medellin, but from Antioquia, decided to give, basically to make it as a gift for Medellin first than to Bogotá, precisely because Medellin was ready with a proposal and the Bogotanos political elites were not ready with a proposal. As you could see, we were still fighting until, I mean, even today, whether or not to do the metro, whether or not to do it, where to do it, how to do it. I mean, it took us like 20 years of discussion. Rather, Antioquia and Medellin were ready. They were ready, organized in a consensus with a proposal. So the national government funded first. So, you know, when people mess up representation, citizens paid a price. And that's what happened. So they were better organized, really, and ready to go for it. So better in collective action will be the answer to that. And they have been, and not only the metro, they also did the first train. They also have, Bogotá did the BRT, and they included also the BRT, because we have similar geography surrounded by mountains. They started with the cable cars, now we have cable cars too. So it has been a nice, you know, co-improvement between the two cities. And I work with the Metro Medellin people, who's a fantastic technical team. It's the best team in public transportation in Colombia by far. They have a lot of experience, very generous. So we work together and learn together, and now we are sort of catching up, sort of. As for the second question, I truly think that, you know, we pay a huge price, you know, for such a disconnection. And, you know, before people, an average citizen don't mention the word institution. And I understand, you know, we are political scientists, we are supposed to study that, we use a different language, it's our language, you know, as math is a language, all that I understand. But first rule of representation is engagement, is listening, is interpretation. You know, I'm a political scientist, I'm a politician too. And it's our job to interpret people if we hope to represent them. We don't listen. We don't do an effort to interpret them, to understand their needs and engagements, and then we pretend to represent them. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. And I think we need to recover that even emotional connection. It's not about values, it's something really much more vivid. Much more vivid. I mean, Michael Sandel's Public Democracy Discontent in 1996. Yeah? 1996, to mention about the United States. We have Bowling Alone of Professor Robert Putnam, right? So Robert Putnam published Bowling Alone when? Like 80s? Like in the 80s, right? Just to mention a couple of examples. From the academia in the United States telling, hey, pay attention to this. People is disengaging, is disconnecting. Deep changes in the way we work, in the way we study. Not only about the income, it's about the purpose, the meaning it gives to your life. It's the sense of being useful, meaningful. It's the sense of belonging. It's not only income, but so when we saw that income deterioration in different types of works, we need to understand that it's not only income deterioration, it's dignity, it's hope, it's engagement, it's belonging. All that comes with jobs and with education. And if you lost that, you're going to react somehow. And yes, and then really we have all the health issue that we have had before the pandemic and much more after the pandemic. If there is something people begs for, literally, it's company. It's to feel to be part of something, that somebody cares about them. So I have to say that, you know, we can blame others. You know, I say, oh, they are populist, obnoxious, and xenophobes, and yeah, probably they are. But at least a reflection, a self-reflection with a little bit of humbleness will help us both as citizens and scholars to understand how the hell do we get into the mess we are now, and how are we going to move out of there. Now, how I did it, it was tough. It was tough. Because I will say that the first year we actually strengthened this sense of connection. I mean, it's like we could manage the way we managed the pandemic. Bogotá was highly praised by the way we have managed the pandemic and the rigorousness and the seriousness. But it's not only the scientific seriousness and the health service seriousness that we had in the provision, is that we literally was honest, we're honest and saying, look, this is a life or death issue. And in order to make decisions about this is the full data. Salud data, for example. Salud data is up until today the most used public website in Colombia. And what we did was to put all the information. Any citizen in Bogotá will see the same board of information that the mayor was looking at, with all the data. Absolute transparency. These things we know for sure. These things we know partially. These things we are guessing. We really don't know. But combining the things we know for sure, we partially know, and the things we don't know, we have to make decisions about how to take care of ourselves. So for example, declaring a quarantine in Bogotá is costly. I mean, 32% of people in Bogotá works in informal jobs. If they cannot go to work, they're not going to have food in their table in a matter of days. So we created the basic income, for example. It was not done before in Bogotá. It took us a year. But to give you a figure, Desmond, we went from 70,000 checks given to Colombia, to Bogotanos because of extreme poverty, to 1.1 million families getting a check in a year to provide them with food, because they can, if we limit the time to move around, they cannot work, they cannot have income. If they cannot have income, they're going to have, hunger. So I think when you honestly put transparently the information, and we said, it's not my life, it's the life of everybody. So we're going to use openly this information. Scholars provide their opinions, universities provide their opinions publicly and openly about what the best choices to manage for more than a year before the vaccines came, how to manage the issue. So it provides us with transparency, with accountability, with different minds and perspectives, with a certain dialogue of how to handle the risk. And it works much, much better, I would say. Now, a second example that I love, I mean, the care blocks is something, I didn't find a book and a report about how to do a care block, We created with the women social movement, we created with the women city council, and we were willing to take the risk. I mean, the learning curve between the first care block and the 24th care block was enormous. And we made mistakes. We offer services that were not as much as used, and then we have shortage of other services that were much more appreciated by the users. But we were open and clear that we were going to move forward and learning, measuring, discussing, and learning along the process. And actually, it provides engagement to everybody. One of the reasons and there was less, almost non-political opposition to the continuity of the care blocks, was precisely because we was such a broadly debate and broadly taken challenge. And let me give you just one final example. According to Bogotá decentralization rules, 10% of the budget of Bogotá, of the central government of Bogotá, has to be distributed between the 20 localities of Bogotá. Chapinero and Sumapaz, and 20 localities. The city is divided in 20 localities. Each locality receives a chunk of money according to the population and to the poverty line, basically, combining those two elements. So the larger the population and the larger poverty in the population, the much more money you receive as a locality. I made a decision as a mayor. I said, look, and there are local elected, local councils by popular election, and there is an appointed local mayor. I appoint the mayor. I said, look, when I saw the way you spend that money, 70% of that money go to infrastructure, to pave holes, basically. 70% of the money. So we're going to do an experiment and an innovation in social participation. Why don't we divide the budget of each locality by half? So half, the local council will continue deciding what to do with the money. And half of it, the other half, will be decided by popular vote by the people living in that locality through budgeting participation, participatory budgeting, right? So people will propose initiatives and ideas. We will support them to translate those ideas into actionable projects and budgetable projects. And once we have the budgetable and technically approved projects, people in the locality can vote. And we will fund the initiative that gets more votes. And it was amazing. You know, the first year in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, only 50,000 people participated voting. In the last election, 400,000 people participated. 400,000 people were discussing how to spend their taxes in their local needs. Of course, for local projects. I mean, we're not going to do participatory budgeting for the metro, but for less complex, more local, more close to the community. It was amazing. Initiatives that will never, ever. You see, the half that was decided by the politicians elected continue the same thing, 70% to pave holes, to infrastructure, for vehicles on the roads. When you ask people, people said, you know what? The informal economy, the street vendor, or the panaderia, or the ferreteria, or these small shops in the community, they are about to close because of the pandemic. We vote by majority to support local businesses and street vendors in the localities. And this type of initiative got like 40% of the votes. Initiatives such as preventing gender-based violence. One of the awful things of the pandemic is that during the quarantine, women who are living with abusive men have to be at home with them, with higher exposure to abuse or violence. So people said, like 15% of the votes were for initiatives to protect women from family or gender-based violence. It will never ever been approved, something like that, asking to the elected local people, local politicians in the local units. Or initiatives to provide veterinary services for pets. Or to do, ¿cómo se dice esto? Como pequeñas huertas, orchards, ¿cómo es que se dice? Food gardens. Food gardens in terrazas, for example, in the neighborhoods. People propose these kind of ideas. Were fantastic projects. And it engaged much more. People now they understand not only that they pay taxes and that money come from, and they also strengthen the social organizations that were able to propose this, because we contracted the execution of the project with the organization that proposed the initiative. But it's also that people learn how the government is done, you know. How do you have to, you know, you get a money and you get a budget, and then you have to do a public funding to get the person to execute something, and how to, you know, there are certain things that you didn't expect that happen. So people get to understand that when that governing is not, you know, is not doing like this. And problems may arise. unexpectedly, and is nobody doing corruption. You know, projects can be delayed for different factors. So it's a sort of democratic workshop, 24/7 in real life. So I really think, and I invite you really to think, how do we emotionally reconnect with meaning and purpose for that thing that we call institutions. But we need to internalize that, to bring it to closest to life, to meaning. And finally, I think this is important because one of the arguments of Michael Sandel that I truly agree with is that people have lost, because of complexity, because of structural factors, people feel and have lost agency around their lives. It's like they don't think that they can do something depends on them that can improve actually the life they live. It's like all what happens to them is coming from nowhere. So actually, bringing people in charge of discussing and debating and making hard decisions and managing complex problems and managing budget. I love to put people on managing of the budget. You're not putting money because you don't want to. I don't know. You want to do the job, or distributing scarce resources to a ton of needs? Come. I can tell you, it's the toughest job ever. Because it's not a technical issue. It's a political decision. It's deciding what are the important things you're not going to do because you don't have enough money for it, not because it's not important to do it. So I love to put people in charge of these kind of decisions, even if it is a small project that they can just get the complexity and learn how these so-called institutions actually work by actual people like them. No, is that the public servant? I love to go to meetings in the community, town halls and stuff, and say, no, we're going to change roles. Now I'm going to be in the community, demanding for the project, and you're going to be here playing my role. And that's the money. We're going to make the decision right here. So I think all that's truly important, literally. And I thought it, long before, I thought it when we were both researchers in the political scientist field, in the parapolitical thing. I truly feel it and try to do it, being both senator. That's why I did the anti-corruption mandate. It's like, no, we really can do something about this. Let's try. And now, with the things we're watching around the world, I'm much more convinced. I'm much more convinced that building a new movement that reconnects people with their life, with their agency, with their purpose, with their understanding of what these so-called institutions actually are and work for, and different types of parties is crucial to save democracy.
Thanks, Claudia. I wanted to ask about the internationalization of the care blocks. The care blocks and the care system has been a huge success, like internationally. There's a lot of people interested in it, cities all over the world replicating it. How was this? How did this happen? And why was it important to make it visible internationally? Yeah.
Well, I would say that it happened. Truly, one of the remarkable things and experiences that I had being mayor was the solidarity between mayors, both within countries and across countries, really. I truly think that people, because of the pandemic, realized that mayors matters, that we are the closest people ever. And who's going to organize how to put the vaccines? We, the mayors. If we need to suspend the mobility in the city, who's going to take the decision? The mayor. If migrants came and you need to register them into the schools, who's going to do that? The mayors. So sort of because of the pandemic, people realized that sort of mayors matters. And many people were generous, really. Particularly, I would say in the case of the care blocks, the United Nations for Women was hugely important from the day one. They said, well, we don't know, but we like the idea, and we will support you with everything we can. And I remember the first 6 months that we were in office, trying to figure it out. We figured it out with this idea of the care blocks, like after 6 months in office. And this was Diana Rodriguez's team, and I give her credit for it because such an amazing, smart person and leader. So the United Nations was there, CEPAL was there. I remember Alicia Bárcenas was in the CEPAL. And we had, with different measures, we had a Zoom, thousands of Zooms, trying to figure out how to attend not only the health crisis, but the social crisis. And for example, I was talking in this Zoom, and Alicia Bárcenas was in CEPAL still, and she said, you know what, I love that idea. I've been talking about the care economy for a decade. Nobody pays attention. And you not only pay attention, but you're trying to figure out how to provide a service for that. How can I help? I said, well, why don't you put a part of your team and help me out figuring out how can I provide a service for that? Because I already know that it accounts for 13% of my economy. But now what? How can I handle that? So I would say the academic world and the international institutions and organizations such as CEPAL, such as United Nations for Women, they were ready to help from day one. So because they were involved along the process, then they were in charge by themselves to spread the word about the care blocks, and that's one of the reasons they became internationally well known. The second thing were like across countries, there are a couple of networks global networks of mayors. CGLU, for example, or Metropolis, among others, are networks of mayors, and we really cooperate enormously. They said, look, we don't have money. None of us have money enough. We don't have time. It's not that we can hire who? McKinsey? McKinsey is going to cost us, $5 million. It will come up with a solution that probably is not practical in 3 years. Have no time and have no money for it. So we need to do this. Nobody knows better than ourselves. We are all dealing with the same challenge. So let's try to learn from each other. So we really use these international networks at its maximum and at its best. And we set up sort of consultant services between us, learning and sharing information and data on how things were going. Carolina Cose, who's now the vice president of Uruguay, recently elected, she was the mayor of Montevideo. Uruguay is the only country in Latin America who happens to have a national system of care. It's the only country in Latin America. So we learned a lot from them, how they did it. So this cross-feeding between practitioners and the academic level and these international organizations created this enthusiasm and generous support. And it's like everybody's achievement. I love that. Everybody feels the ownership of the idea, and that's fantastic. And Harvard, for example, is now documented in the Harvard case, the care blocks. And in 2023, we won the largest and most famous social award in the world as the best social innovation in 2023. So sort of unexpectedly, but interestingly. Thank you so much. Really. Has been a pleasure. Thank you.